Thank you very much. So the next topic or presentation is going to be a little bit different from the previous ones because I want to present some findings on a big study that we've done in the last couple of years. Oh, it's moving further. I don't know why. And it was funded by the European Research Council. It's about public opinion in Western Europe about different topics related to education policy. And I would like to show you some results from the questions on vocational education and training specifically. We had many other issues in that survey, for example, trade-offs in the financing of education. What do you do if you want to increase spending on education, but there are people worry about cutbacks in other parts of the welfare state? What about governance of education? Do people want more decentralization, or do they want more private involvement of schools and universities? I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, but here I'm just going to focus on the VT part, basically. So this is just, as a starting point, responses to a very general question about whether people would like to see more public investments in education. And the bars indicate agreement with the statement that more public money should be spent on these different parts of the welfare state. And as you can see, education is indeed very, very popular across European countries. And I should also say the countries included in the study were Germany, France, Denmark, Sweden, Italy, Spain, the UK, and Ireland. So it's a rough distribution of the different kinds of welfare states, different kinds of political economies we have in Western Europe. And here you can see that more than 80% of the people all over these countries would indeed support much more spending on, or more and much more spending on education. And in that regard, education is more popular, if you want to call it like that, than, for example, spending on pensions or spending on labor market policies, and least popular is increasing spending on defense, even though Donald Trump might not like to hear that these days. Of course, we have a lot of variation across countries. I don't want to go too much into detail, and probably people in the back might not be able to read all the little things here. But what is important to note that there are some differences across countries. For example, in Germany and Italy, people are really very much worried about education. They are especially keen on expanding spending on education. In Sweden, it's actually more about healthcare. United Kingdom is also more about healthcare. So you see some variation across countries, but even though you have this variation, education and healthcare continues to be at the top of the public's agenda. Now to vocational training, more specifically, we also ask people for their preferences regarding the distribution of education spending across the different sectors of the education system. And I think in the last 2 days we've spoken a lot about the fact that many people might not like or might not support VET as much as they like higher education, or the attractiveness of VT might be a problem. And I think our survey data actually shows a slightly different picture, because what you can see across all countries, if you sum it up across all countries, people would very much like to see more spending on general schools, but also on VET. And the support for additional spending on higher education and early childhood education and care is actually lower than the support for spending on VET. So I think that's good news. And you can even see that in some countries, France, but also Denmark and Spain, the support for additional spending on VET is especially high. And notably, some of these countries at least don't actually have a strong VET system. So this shows that the public is quite well aware of what's going on in other countries in Europe. And I think by now you can say that people also in Italy and Spain who may be suffering, especially under high levels of youth unemployment, start to realize that increasing spending, public investments on VET is a good solution to this problem. We have additional, more specific questions in the survey. So this is agreement to the statement that the government should encourage young persons to pursue VET rather than higher education. So this is basically a question about what should the government do to promote VET. And again, you can see quite, on average, quite a high support for that statement. So this is the share of the people in these countries that agree or strongly agree with the statement. So look at France, almost 80% of the people agree or strongly agree with the statement, even though you would say, well, France, it's all about universities and higher education, but this survey data shows it's actually quite a lot of support for VET in this country. And notably in Germany, where VET is already well established, you see actually quite low levels of support for that, because here it's just the opposite, that people are more interested in expanding the higher education sector. Another example, this is agreement with the statement that the government should put more pressure on employers to provide opportunities for vocational training. And here the average level of support is even higher. So if you look at especially Southern European countries, Italy and Spain, which are suffering from high levels of youth unemployment, more than 90% of the people actually agree or strongly agree with that statement. But again, across the board, Germany again is the countries with the lowest level of agreement here. Interestingly, you see strong support for the government to become more actively involved in the promotion of VET. And I think that to me that was really surprising that the average level of support is so high across these countries. Then the third example, these are responses to the following question. Here we ask people, imagine a school leaver with average grades. What kind of post-secondary education would you recommend to this person? And here we say especially average grades, because we didn't want to say a very good student, because then it's pretty obvious that this person would probably go to university. We also didn't want to say a below average student, because then it makes things different. So this is basically about a student in the middle of the distribution. And the blue bars show levels of support for people who say that these persons should go to higher education. The red ones is school-based VT, and the green ones is firm-based VT, apprenticeships. And again, I at least was very surprised that across all these countries, support for firm-based VT is so high. So in almost all countries, more than 50% of the people actually say they would recommend firm-based VT. So I would say this is pretty strong evidence that the image of VT is actually much better than many people think, even in countries where we don't really have yet a strong VT system. Now to go into a little bit more of a deeper analysis, we are also interested in the question which factors influence these public preferences, which factors influence public opinion. And in social science, we do this with statistical analysis, regression analysis. So this is basically a summary graph of the results from this regression analysis. Very easy to interpret though. You see the dots, which is the size of the effect, and then you see the lines, and which indicate the statistical uncertainty around these estimates. And if the dot and the line is far away from the red line, then this is a statistical significant effect. And if it's cross-cutting the red line, then it's not significant. So basically, the question is here, who are the people that prioritize spending on vocational education and training? And not surprisingly, these are mostly people who themselves have a vocational background. And also, interestingly, since I'm a political scientist, I'm also interested in the role of political ideology. People who identify with a conservative ideological position are also more likely to prioritize spending on VT. That's interesting if you care about party politics and so on. The other question is, who supports government promoting VT? Remember, we had this question, the government should promote VT rather than higher education. And here we see actually that highly educated people are less likely to support that statement, as it's pretty obvious. But again, we see that people with a conservative ideological position are more in favor of that. And then the mirror picture is basically given in the next picture. Who wants to put more pressure on employers? And here it's people identifying with left-wing ideology who are more likely to support this statement, who would like to put more pressure on employers. But apart from that, we don't actually see a lot of differentiation, except that the rich people, those with the income in the highest quintile, are also less likely to support this. So this is basically a little bit the class politics dimension here. So in short, to sum up, and what are the most important takeaway points from this study, I would say for the purposes of this conference, first of all, European citizens are actually strongly supportive of further public investments in education and VET especially, and the support for VET is much higher than commonly assumed, I would argue. And there's actually also little conflict about this issue. You've seen in the previous slide that there are many variables related to education, income, class background, which are not statistically significant. That means in reverse that people are actually strongly agree with this. So there's not a lot of conflict about the necessity that this should be done, that there should be additional investment in VET. But there's some evidence for a partisan conflict, so right-wing people are more likely to be against putting pressure on employers to provide additional training opportunities. Left-wing people are slightly more in favor. So I think that's important if you think about the policy level. How do you solve this issue in an environment that is increasingly characterized by high degree of party competition? And so what are the policy implications? I think the first one is very clear. If you look at these figures as a policymaker and you see these high levels of support, then you should probably really devote more attention to VET and also resources to VET than is often done, because this will be rewarded electorally. And then finally, I think these different ideological positions on this issue can be solved if you look at VET schemes that combine school-based and firm-based training, because this is a good partisan compromise, as both employers are involved in this and the public is also involved in the promotion of that. Okay, thank you very much.